This is Deuteronomy chapter 34 and our last episode from the book of Deuteronomy. What a relief. Last time we're going to read from the book of Deuteronomy. I feel bad about how many chapters we skipped. If you ever want access to Papa John's scripture notes, there are so many pearls and scholarly footnotes in between the rib cages of the verses of scripture. All I'm trying to do is get back as close as we can to the original history, language, and context of scripture in its purest form, as far as it's written and translated correctly. I think the purest form of scripture would be the way it's written in God's heart, um, in his bosom. But anyway, that being said, Deuteronomy chapter 34, Moses is going to say goodbye. The children of Israel are going to follow Joshua and Caleb into the promised land. And if you understand that Joshua is a shared name and that Jesus Christ went by the same name in mortality, his earthly ministry, he didn't go by Jesus Christ. That came later as a title that we use to associate with that figure in history, Yeshua or Joshua. And what's cool about the image portrayed here is the prophet Moses could only take them so far. And then Yeshua had to take them into the promised land. I think that's a key. That's a pearl of wisdom about the proper role of a prophet and the need for a Messiah. Even for the prophet, he needs to be saved too. Does that make sense? We depend completely on he who is mighty to save, don't we? Uh, our LDS scholar Jared Halverson begins with verse 1. Moses went up from the plains of Moab and unto the mountain of Nebo to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And Jehovah showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, or Dan, the north to the south. He sees it all. Verse 4. And then we're going to skip that because I have so much to cover, but I think it's a beautiful image here of God showing Moses the land so he gets a glimpse of it. I think that's very merciful on his part. Now, Jono Vandor, actually, he's going to take us through verse 4 in the New King James Version of the Bible. Then Jehovah said to him, This is the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. So Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Jehovah, and he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Bath Peor. But no one knows his grave to this day. Now Jono says, now maybe Keith will know what I'm talking about when I say there's a mention of this in the book of Jude, right? Nehemiah, can I ask, what is the assumption of Moses? Uh, what's that? Do you know what that is? And Nehemiah says, yeah, it's part of what's called the pseudepigrapha, which were Jewish writings in the Second Temple period. They had all kinds of interesting stories and speculations, and it's very possible that at least some of those books that we call the pseudepigrapha were considered scriptural, or at least divinely inspired by some people. The vast majority of Jews definitely did not accept them, but it's very possible, for example, the Essenes, the keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, accepted some of those books as being binding or as being even prophetic. So I'm not sure where Jono gets his question, but it seems like he's referencing Jude and some phrase uh, in the book of Jude. But isn't that an interesting answer from Nehemiah Gordon? I appreciate that insight. Jono responds by saying, and this is apparently what Jude was quoting from. It's interesting. It's curious. So Jude was quoting from this book. And what do you call it? The book of, well, let's just continue. I'm sorry. The Assumptions or something? Uh, and then Jono says, But in this case, no one knows. Wait, where am I? Pseudepigrapha. This is apparently what Jude was quoting from. It's interesting. It's curious. And then Nehemiah interjects again, while saying that he quotes from the assumptions of Moses in Jude. I'm not sure that's the case. What would happen is you had these legends and stories, and they would be written down in different places, and some of them would find their way into the rabbinical midrash, and some of them would find their way into the pseudepigrapha, and other stories like that may have been picked up and related in the New Testament. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily quoting from one another. They all may be quoting from those popular legends that are being told among the people. Okay, I'm gaining a little more understanding. I hope you are as well. Jono ends this interaction by saying, but in case no one knows, I mean, in this case, there is no, well, hang on, wait a minute, Keith. Didn't you go to a mosque where Moses was? Nehemiah says, oh my goodness, I want to skip notes, and I, I, I know I have to keep going. Nehemiah says, what's the Avinu for those who don't know? Keith Johnson says, our Father who art in heaven, Avinu She Ba Sha Ma Yim Yet Kadesh Shemcha. Your name be sanctified. I actually went into that place. Okay, so now he's going to talk about the place that they claim is where Moses is buried. Here's my thought, Jono. Okay, so I went into this mosque, Jono, and here's why. And this is why I don't care about crossing borders. The earth is Jehovah's and the fullness thereof. That's what my scriptures tell me. And so when I went in there, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm walking in under the authority as an ambassador of God's name. I'm coming in here as an ambassador of God's name. I actually have a lot of respect for the Muslims in certain areas. I really do. I really do have a lot of respect for them in certain areas in terms of the true attempts that some of them make. That is an attempt to try to connect with God. And he's describing a place that Nehemiah said, I won't go there. And that's the paragraph I skipped. But it's a mosque and in a dangerous part of the Middle East. So Keith went without him. Keith continues, I don't want to get into politics regarding the Muslims. In the series that I'm doing, Time Will Tell, I actually did a whole section with Muslims where they took me to the places that Nehemiah wouldn't go with me to. I actually went into the mosque with my little camera and the head guy who's in charge of the mosque. And Nehemiah will tell you how big of a deal it is. I said to him, can we open up the gate where Moses' tomb is? And he opened up the gate where Moses' tomb is, and he let me go inside the actual tomb, not the mosque, but in through the tomb. He unlocked the gate and let me film it for the people so that you can see it. And they acknowledge that this is not Moses' tomb, but it's a representative of Moses' tomb. This is why I think it's so important, and I appreciate Nehemiah for this, for us to dig, to find out what the bottom is, and get past a lot of the assumptions that people make about other people and about other groups and other things. I'm just saying, let's go find out for ourselves. But it was an amazing experience. It sounds like it. Now, Nehemiah adds to that account. He says, so the reason I brought Keith to this place, so I guess in this case, Nehemiah and Keith went together. Many times, Nehemiah's like, I'm not going there. It's been fun following these guys as they team tag and teach all over the world. So Nehemiah says, I brought Keith to this place. This is the place the Muslims claim to be the tomb of Moses. It's a lot of times, I think a lot of people in the Western world don't know this. Islam claims, or Muslims claim, many of the stories that appear in the Tanakh and in the New Testament. By the way, but they have those stories, but with a distortion. So, for example, they have the story of Isaac being bound and being almost sacrificed by Abraham, except they swap out the name Isaac with Ishmael. So they switch the brothers of who that happened to. Who they claim Ishmael to be their ancestor. And they have Haman from the book of Esther as an official in the court of Pharaoh, and all kinds of details that are in our Bible. And we read and we're like, boy, they got that story confused. They say Muhammad was a caravan driver. He was the head of a caravan of his wife, Khadijah, and he would sit around the fire in the desert with Jews and Christians and other people in the caravan, and the other people would tell stories, and he heard these stories. So they've got all kinds of stories that are different than what we find in the Jewish sources. and different from what we find in the Christian sources. From our perspective, we would say they're distorted versions of the story. Of course, they say we've distorted the story, and we are right and they are wrong. Of course, they think they're right and we're wrong. But I brought Keith to this site to show him an example of that. And this example is that they have this site dedicated to the tomb of Moses. And of course, we're told we don't know where Moses' tomb was. He was buried on the eastern side of the Jordan, somewhere in a valley in the plains of Moab. And where they have their tomb of Moses is on the western side of the Jordan, somewhere in the Judean desert, in the plains of Jericho, on the wrong side of the Jordan River. So there's an example of how they got some of the details of the story, but they've distorted it from our perspective and get it wrong. This is actually a geographical and architectural representation of this type of thing. I thought that was interesting. I have to admit, Nehemiah continues, that I wasn't comfortable going into the mosque for my own reasons. I understand why Keith went in, and this I think goes back to a dispute that you have among. If you ask Jews what God did to, I'm sorry, if you ask most Jews what God did, the Muslims worship what God did. The Muslims worship. They'll say, "Oh, the same God." So do they worship the same God as us? And okay. So most Jews would say the Muslims worship the same God as us, but they just have the stories wrong. They've just got the stories confused. But if you ask many Christians what God the Muslims worship, this is what I've heard at least. They'll say that the Muslims worship Satan, and it's not that they got the stories wrong, it's that they're worshiping a false God. And Nehemiah continues, I try to stay out of these disputes. If you ask most Messianics, they'll say that the Muslims worship Satan. They worship the moon god. And that's funny because that moon symbol comes from the Turks, not from the Muslims. But whatever. It's a very late thing. But anyway, so they've got some of the details right, and so I'll give you an example of their observance. They don't eat pig like Torah says, but they'll eat shellfish. So they've got some details, but they're confused. They begin their month with the sighting of the new moon, just like the Jews did in ancient times, just like we read about the Mishnah, written in around 210 AD. 400 years before Muhammad came around, and the Jews were sighting the new moon in the land of Israel. The Muslims don't do it from the land of Israel, they do it anywhere in the world. They'll often have their holidays a day before the Jews do, or before the sighted new moon, and then most Muslims don't even sight the moon. They look at the dark moon, and that's because that's easier to calculate. A very small percentage of Muslims look for the sight of the new moon. They go by the dark moon in Saudi Arabia. Interesting. Then he ends by saying, instead of facing Jerusalem, they face Mecca. Originally, they did face Jerusalem until some things happened and Muhammad changed it to Mecca. So you see these little things they took from Judaism, but with some differences. And from the Jewish perspective, it's a distortion. And again, they say we're distorted. But on the judgment day, we'll all find out that the Jews are right. And the Muslims are wrong. Maybe we'll find out that we're all or both wrong, and it was the Methodists who knew. Oh, too much. Funny guy. Now, back to our LDS scholar. Verse 5. So Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, according to the words of Jehovah. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But Jared says, don't jump to conclusions too quickly. The verse then says, no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. So then Jared says, now on the one hand, that seems to be a fitting in for Moses, because he has left markers everywhere in Egypt, in Midian, and now here in Moab, wishing that he could cross the river, the Jordan River, but pointing the people towards it for themselves. He is a man of miracles, and in a way, it seems fitting that his death would be a mystery and a miracle, because his birth was too, as was his life that unfolded in between this miracle baby of Amram and Jochebed, and their willingness to put their life on the line, and a child that was meant to die that lived. And here, 120 years later, when there should have been death, there's only life. He set before them life and death in these last closing chapters, and he asked them to choose life. Will God let Moses choose life as well? Great question, and we're going to answer that, or we'll talk about the different possibilities before the end of this episode. Back to Jonah of Andor, he continues reading, and so then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo on top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho, and Jehovah showed him all the land. Keith Johnson says, stop there, folks. I want to just stop just a second. This is really cool. So this is one of the things I got a chance to do, Jono, when I was over in Israel this spring during the Time Will Tell series. I went to the area of Jericho where you can look from Jericho across to where Moses would have looked over across to Jericho. And actually, it's one of the places that Nehemiah had told me, do not go to Jericho. It's a Palestinian controlled, do not go there. And of course, I went there because I had to deal with this issue. But going there and looking across and seeing Mount Nebo, and then knowing that that's where Moses looked across at the land, and then that's the spot. And we're actually going to this spot, Jonah. We're going to go over to the section where folks have their baptism. They go across the River Jordan, where Israel, somewhere in that area, crossed over before they went to Jericho and marched around the town 7 times, and the walls fell down. So here's the grace. The grace is, now, is this grace or is this mean? I want to ask the question. Nehemiah, you're back. I want you to answer this question. Jonah and Nehemiah. So Yehovah tells Moses, go up and look at everything you've worked for, but you don't get to go. Jonah says, it's interesting that you should say that, Keith, because as I was reading this, I did have a look at my study notes, and it's interesting when the study notes sort of interject their own opinion, because that's rare in my New King James study notes. But in this particular case, it says, Moses remained God's faithful servant. Moses was granted by God a close-up view of the land. How sad that his feet were not able to walk where his eyes danced. So that's very poetic, but they took some liberties there, right? That's Jonah's point. And Nehemiah says, I think this is really one of the most tragic passages in the Bible, in a sense. Moses has worked for this for 40 some years, like he was out in the desert with his sheep and just wanted to be left alone with his wife and his kids, and God calls him on this mission. He spends 40 years, he's standing before Pharaoh, stuttering and saying, let my people go. On Nehemiah. And for 40 years, he's carried these people and he stood before Pharaoh and he did all this stuff, and now God's saying, you can't go up to the mountain, but you can go up to the mountain, but you can't go in. And he knew that he wasn't going to go there, but he said, we as a people will get to the promised land. Nehemiah then adds, now imagine Moses, he wasn't doing it for 4 years or 14 years. He was doing it for 40 years, and he was able to look at it from the mountaintop, but he wasn't able to cross over. Are you with me, guys? So they're feeling some of the disappointment, sharing in that. Nehemiah then continues, I think, to me, the message here is, this is how important my word is. I gave you a commandment, and you kind of did it, but you did it your own way, Moses, not my way. And this is how important. And look, God doesn't judge all of us by the standard. He says, I'm sanctified by those who are close to me. He says that when he burns up the 2 sons of Aaron. He doesn't burn all of us up, I've done stuff that I deserve to be burned up, and I never got burned, Nehemiah confesses. But for those who are close to him, if you're close to God, he says, I will sanctify myself by them in the eyes of the people. And Moses, he's saying to him, look, this might be a small thing. You kind of did what I commanded, but not exactly. I need to show the people how important it is to obey. So God is saying, my word is important to be obeyed, and you're going to have to suffer for that. You're going to have to be the example for the people. Wow, his word is that important that he wouldn't even give concessions or make an exception for Moses, because then God is a respecter of persons. He's playing favoritism Interesting. Now Nehemiah continues. Now I've actually been to that mountaintop over in the kingdom of Jordan, Har Navu, Nuvo, Har Navu, Navu, aka Mount Nebo, or with the English and the Christians, it's Mount Nebo, but with an uh, the Jewish they pronounce it in Hebrew with a V, Nebo. Anyway, and if you get there early in the morning, you can look out and you see the towers in the distance in Jerusalem. You can't literally see all the way to dawn or Be'er Sheva. That had to be in the that had to be in this prophecy, but you can see about 20 to 30 miles away, you can see Jerusalem, the tower sticking up on the ridge, and you can see the Dead Sea spread out before you, and the Jordan Valley, and the mountains of Ephraim. You can see a significant amount of land, but that had to be in prophecy to see all the way to Dan and Beersheba. And maybe that was a prophetic meaning when he says, I've seen it. I know we're going in as a people. I'm not going to be there, but God showed me in prophecy. So maybe he did see even further than you can physically see, is Nehemiah's point, because it was partly a vision, which would make sense. I like that. Jared Halverson, our LDS scholar, then says, verse 7 Moses was 120 years old when he died. Well, died. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Back to the verse. His eye was not dim, nor his natural face or his natural force abated. Well, he said a little while ago that I'm feeling a little worn down. I'm a little tired. But according to this, oh no, he could have kept going. He could have climbed more mountains. He could have crossed more seas. But he's left that to us. In a way, this reminds me, Jared Halverson says, it reminds me of Christ, who cried out with a loud voice from the cross. And if you're about to die from crucifixion, there's no strength to cry loudly. No, Jesus gave up the ghost. It wasn't taken from him. And in a similar way, here for Moses, this is a different kind of passing. And then Israel mourns for Moses 30 days, as they had with Aaron before him. Jono, again from Australia. So he was 120 years old. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. That's interesting. I got to hang on a second because earlier on, didn't he say to everyone, hey, everybody, look, I'm really old. I'm 120 years old. I can no longer go in or go out. Nehemiah then says, look, this is what Jews do. They complain. Oi, get, how do they say? Oi, gavolt. Oi, gavolt. oi, oi. I'm 175 years old. So Jews, we do this. We complain. All right. Oi gavolt. Nehemiah then says next, and there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom Jehovah knew face to face. Nehemiah says, I hear that, and I say, Joshua wrote that. Big deal. So what? How many years have gone by? A few years? 10 years? 20 years? 30 years? So the last 30 years, we haven't had a prophet like Moses. I'm not really impressed with that. Can I read to you from my JPS, my Jewish Publication Society translation? It says there, never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom Jehovah singled out face to face. Never again. Now, why is there the difference? And now Nehemiah is going to answer that question. This is something, a grammatical issue called prophetic past. I'll read what it says in Genesis Hebrew grammar, or Jessanus Hebrew grammar. It's where you say something in the past tense. And the reason you say it that way is because you're so certain it's going to happen. I'm sure we've talked about this before, but let me read you how Jessanus describes it. He's not Jewish. He's a Hebrew grammarian from the 19th century. And he says it's used to express facts which are undoubtedly eminent and therefore, in the imagination of the speaker, already accomplished. This use of the perfect meaning, the past, occurs most frequently in prophetic language. The prophet so transports himself and imagination into the future that he describes the future event as if it had already been seen or heard by him. In other words, Nehemiah says he's so certain these things are going to happen, he describes it as something in the past tense. Let me give you some examples of this. Isaiah 5:13 is an example. He says, "Assuredly, my people will suffer exile." Now that's the JPS. The King James Version says, "Therefore, my people are gone into captivity." Now in English, it's already happened, right? Therefore, my people are gone into captivity. Whereas in the Hebrew, it's written in the past tense. It happened. They have gone into captivity. They are gone into captivity. But Isaiah was talking about something that hadn't happened yet. That wouldn't happen for many, many more years, many years after that. And why did he do that? Isaiah did that because he's viewing these events as if they've already happened prophetically. I like that. And to me, that's similar to the praying with the language of faith. And the first time that ever happened to Papa John, and the state patriarch, Ron McIntyre, taught Shauna Lee and I in a class that he taught in church about the language of faith. And he says in the scriptures, the language of faith, including your prayers, that I may. Lord, I'm asking for this, this, and this, that I may, and then you declare what you're asking, why you're asking for that. And that keeps you honest because it better be a righteous purpose. I would like to keep our house from going into foreclosure that I may have a, whatever. And you gut check. But he also taught to pray with the past tense, which always made me nervous as a kid. My parents would pray as we'd go on vacation and travel. They'd say, "Thank you for helping us or not helping us. Thank you that we arrived safely." And I'm like, "Well, we haven't even got on the road yet." And as a child, I was just nervous about them saying that before it happened. And now I'm more bold in my prayers and I use that past tense phraseology. And the first time I used that after Patriarch McIntyre taught that lesson, I was up on the roof of Shauna Lee's mother's house. We were doing repairs. My oldest daughter, Danielle, was with us, but she had to go to dance practice. So she took our car, and I'm up on the roof working, and she says goodbye. She gets in the car, and as she turns and drives out of sight, I got the darkest impression that something bad was going to happen. And it wasn't my imagination. It was an honest, like, dark omen. So what did I do? I declared the language of faith, and I thank God for protecting Danielle and that she arrived at dance practice safely. And later she called and described how she went through many intersections once the brakes failed. And the brakes had worked fine. I'd driven the car to grandma's house, and she had, with the help of God, gotten through busy intersections and down residential streets and over speed bumps. And when she coasted into the parking lot for dance practice, she jammed it into park because she didn't know how to use the emergency brake. What kind of father doesn't teach their child what the hand brakes for? Anyway, that I didn't expect to share, but I love what Nehemiah is talking about here, although there's a little different angle, I believe. So again, in the JPS, um, let's just start here. If you understand this as a past tense, that means up until the time of Joshua, there was nobody like Moses for those 100 years, those 60 years, whatever it is. Maybe later on there would be somebody like Moses who was even greater than Moses. And the Jewish understanding of this passage, just like I read in the JPS, is that this is a prophetic past, meaning this is being described in the past tense because it is a certainty that it will take place. That really is why they translated it as never again there arose someone like Moses who knew Jehovah face to face. Where do they get that idea? Like maybe there would be another prophet greater than Moses? How do they know that Moses's prophecy was unique? So I'm sure we've talked about this. We have earlier on, I think in the book of Numbers, where God says specifically that his prophecy to Moses is unique. Now let's continue because this is interesting. Nehemiah says, so go back to verse 6. Here's the money ball. Keith likes to say that. Here's the money ball verse 6. Jonah reads, "Hear now my words, if there is a prophet among you. I, Jehovah, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house." Nehemiah then says, with him I speak mouth to mouth. So the type of prophecy that Moses has is unique. No other prophet ever had it. And as I said, the Jewish understanding of taking this as a prophetic past is that not only has no one ever had it, no one ever will have it. This is a unique form of prophecy that only Moses would have. Again, in Exodus 33:11, it says the same thing. And Yehovah spake to Moses, panim el panim, face to face. Karasher yedaber esh el rehio, as a man speaks to his fellow. They would speak face to face, and that's unique. That's a unique type of prophecy. Keith Johnson says, is the set time of weeping and mourning 30 days? So when he's died, why did they mourn for 30 days? Nehemiah says, well, so that's an interesting thing. There's both numbers given in the Bible, 7 and 30. If you look at Genesis 50, verse 10, and they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is in Transjordan, and they wept there a great weeping, very great indeed, and he made for his father a mourning of 7 days. They were mourning his death for 7 days. Jonah says, so was it 40 days? Did it take him like 40 days to embalm him? And Nehemiah says, right. And that's because they were dragging his body everywhere. But then, for example, they mourned for him 70 days. That was the Egyptian custom. But then in verse 10, when they were actually go to his funeral and they bury him, the Hebrews mourned for him for 10 days. If you look at Numbers 28:29, they wept for Aaron for 30 days. What's happened is Jewish tradition is, well, they've taken the 7 days and they've taken the 30 days, and they'll do both of those. They'll do what's called the sit shiva for 7 days. We actually sit on the ground for 7 days, and some literally sit on the ground and sit on a lower chair. But originally, they literally sat on the ground for 7 days, like in Job, and they would mourn. This is still the core period of mourning, and which is 7 days. Then they'll do a 30-year period of mourning, which includes the 7 days, but they won't be sitting on the ground for those 7 days. But at the end of the 30 days, then they'll have a ceremony, usually a graveside or memorial service. So they've kind of combined both traditions in Judaism. And look, these are traditions. It's the thing, people say, well, how many days are we commanded to mourn? God didn't command you to mourn. If you're not sad, then there might be something wrong with you if your loved one dies. But God doesn't need to command us to mourn, just like he doesn't need to command us to be happy. It's something that we should be happy in certain occasions, and as Solomon said, there's a time to be happy and a time to be sad. Fair enough, Jono says. And then he says, Keith, the final 2 verses of the Torah, the final 2 verses of Deuteronomy 34, verses 11 and 12, would you be so kind, my friend? So Keith reads the last 2 verses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses when Yehovah spake face to face, and who did all these miraculous signs and wonders Yehovah sent him to do in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever seen the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. Nehemiah says, wow, I'm going to start with verse 10. And then he goes through this long, it's too long for Papa John to put you through me trying to sound it out with the transliteration phonetics that I've put in here. But then he says, and there's our tradition. When we finish reading something in Scripture, a section in this case, the entire Bible, the entire Torah, the first 5 books, the Torah, we say, chazak, chazak, ve-ne-chazak, which means, we translate it, strong, strong, and be strengthened. Keep going strong. That's cool. Now we're going to just shift gears slightly. A little bit more. I'm sorry. This is Nehemiah again. He says, we're done with the Torah and we want to wrap this up, but I absolutely have to read something real quick. I want to read the first 3 verses of the book of Joshua. And he says, I'm going to read it and translate directly from the Hebrew. It says, and it came to pass after the death of Moses, the servant of Yehovah, And Jehovah said to Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of Moses, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. And now rise up and cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I give to them, to the children of Israel. Every place where the sole of your feet steps, I will give it to you, as I spoke to Moses. And then Nehemiah adds, and what this says to me is, the Torah is over. We've finished the Torah. Now get up, cross the Jordan, and walk it out. Get up, cross the Jordan, and walk it out. And that's what I want to call on all the people to do. We have finished the Torah. We've learned it. Go back and read it again yourselves. But now it's time to get up, rise up, cross over your spiritual Jordan, go into the land, and walk it out. I love it. Now, here's something interesting. I'm skipping to the New Testament. Papa John has given you a preview of when we study the New Testament. And with the help of Michael Rood and the NASA calendar, the retro dating calendar, where you can go forward and backward in time with the computers that now track the planets and rotations, the moon, the stars, the earth. In the New Testament, when we get there, there's event 119, because Michael Rood, with the help of the NASA calendar, took the 4 Gospels and put them in sequence of events and numbered them and gave us dates with the help of the NASA retro dating computer. And he found one event so he could go forward and backwards, one event recorded in all 4 Gospels, and then he was able to do this. So this event 119 is not recorded in John. It's recorded only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we're going to focus on the Matthew account. And this is Yeshua, or Jesus, ordained as the Kohen Gadol. He's ordained as the high priest. This is the transfiguration, often called the Mount of Transfiguration. It's actually the high Sabbath, the most holy day of the year. This is Yom Kippur, the 10th day of the 7th month, 4027 FC, which means from creation. Tuesday, September 30th, 27 Common Era. Week 33, day 227. And Papa John inserts the second voice from heaven. So I hope this gets you excited for the New Testament, even though that's, I believe, next year. This incident occurs about 8 days after the teachings in Luke, or the 6 days after the teachings when he fed the 4,000. That's in Matthew and Mark. Yeshua takes Kepha, that's Peter, and Yaakov, that's Jacob, and Yohanan, that's John, to a mountain where Moses and Elihu ordained Yeshua as the Kohen Gadol after the order of Melchizedek. This is the incident when some of the disciples get to see Yeshua in his kingdom before their death, but they will be sworn to secrecy until after the resurrection. Matthew 17. Now in yellow, I have the King James Version. Originally, that was a brown ink, and then the black ink is more with the turquoise color. And we're reading basically the original King James and then the corrected King James. Verse 1, and after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart. In the corrected King James, after 6 days, there's a footnote, we'll get to it. Yeshua took Kepha, Yaakov, and Yohanan, his brother, apart and brought them up into the high mountain. So the footnote here reads, both Matthew 17:1 and Mark 9:2 report that after Mita, or 6 days, Yeshua took 3 of his disciples to a high mountain, where he changed before their eyes and shone with the brightness of the sun. Luke 9:28 records that same incident, his ordination as the Kohen Gadol, aka the high priest, after the order of Melchizedek, occurred about Hoshea, 8 days after the teachings, after Meta, the 6 days, and is the 7th day, while about Hoshea, having not yet reached the point of or number of the next number, 8 days. It's also the 7th day. Both the Greek construction records, both Greek constructions record the same event occurring at the same time by using 2 parallel Greek mathematical constructions. The 7th day after, the inclusive of the day, a 3rd mathematical construction, the teaching that concluded with the feeding of the 4,000 disciples on the 7th day of the month, brings us to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. Isn't that interesting to connect those dots and realize, well, of course, the great high priest, after the order of Melchizedek, would have that happen on the holiest day of the year for the Jewish calendar. And I should say Yehovah's calendar. Verse 2, and was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And the only thing different with the corrected King James is instead of raiment, it says garments, whereas white as light. Jared Halverson, our LDS scholar, he says this, verse 2, Jesus was transfigured before them. And if you look at the Greek word behind, transfigured, it sounds like metaphoric, and metamorphosis is how we would say in English. What is this transfiguration? Is it a total transformation? Is it a metamorphosis before their eyes? The way Matthew describes it, Jesus' face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. In Luke's version, the fashion of his countenance was altered. His raiment was white and glistening. In the Greek of that word, glycerin means to flash forth like lightning. This is Jesus gleaming radiantly, his face and his clothing. In the Mark version, his raiment became shining, exceedingly white as snow. So no fuller on earth can wipe them out. Fuller meaning soap. Remember, a fuller is someone who washes clothing and gets rid of stains. But no matter how good your soap and no matter how much elbow grease, no fuller on earth could produce such whiteness as what Peter, James, and John witnessed in Jesus. They thought they knew him, but now he is far beyond anything we had imagined. Verse 3, and behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with them. And in the corrected King James, and there appeared to them Moses and Elihu talking with them. You know, they should have put Moshe, the Hebrew word for Moses, Moshe. Now back to our LDS scholar. Now, who is Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Far beyond the lawgiver Moses and the law of God personified, Jesus Christ, he's Jesus Christ. In fact, to you scribes and Pharisees, ye hypocrites, waiting to accuse me of doing damage to the law of Moses. Oh no, Moses, Moses and I are pretty tight. We're hanging out here under the Transfiguration. And those of you that would accuse me of being a blasphemer, of claiming some kind of connection to God, Jared Howerson continues, well, here's Elijah who took down the real blasphemers, and he's totally fine with me up here. It's really interesting to also see Moses and Elijah are meant to symbolize what Jesus, I'm sorry, to symbolize with Jesus being transfigured above and beyond them. In other words, in other things, this is another thing to realize here. What else do Moses and Elijah have in common? They ended their ministries with unfinished business too. Both were caught up to heaven without tasting death. Verse 4, then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, as in Master, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee and one for Moses and one for Elias, or as it says in Hebrew, Elihu. And let me just read the corrected King James. Kepha said to Yeshua, Master, it is good for us to be here. If you will, let us make 3 Sukkot, which means tabernacles here. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Eliyahu. Verse 5, while he yet spoke, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear ye him. And then in the corrected King James, it's pretty similar. While he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice came out of the clouds, said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, Shema. Hear and obey him. Do you see the repetitiveness of that? Shema, instead of just hear him, Shema means listen and obey, hear and obey. That's powerful. Now the footnote by the word him, the voice from heaven, the second bat kol, authenticated Yeshua as the prophet that we must Shema, we must hear and obey. And those who will not hear and obey will be diligently sought out and judged accordingly. And that goes back to Deuteronomy that we're just finishing tonight or in this episode. Now, what's Papa John? Where am I going with this? Moses died, right? He was buried. And yet here he appeared to Jesus Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration and the others that were present. In the Book of Mormon, get this, There's a prophet named Alma, and he dies. And it reads in chapter 45 of the book called Alma, "Behold, this we know that he was a righteous man," referring to Alma. "And the saying went abroad in the church that he was taken up by the Spirit, or buried by the hand of the Lord, even as Moses. But behold, the scripture saith, the Lord took Moses unto himself, and we suppose that he has also received Alma in the Spirit unto himself. Therefore, for this cause we know nothing concerning his," meaning Alma's, "death and burial." Now, this is part of the scattering, the dispersed that have traveled, like it says here in Deuteronomy, to the far ends of the planet, or, but God is mindful of them, and they're trying to stay true to the law of Moses, and maybe their scriptures have been somewhat corrupted. We know ours have been, or at least Papa John's making that clear as we scratch past the surface level of the ink, printed in English. Now, we're almost to my point. Section 10. This is another book of scripture in the restored gospel called the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 110, verse 11. This happened in the 1800s in America. "And after this vision closed, the heavens were again opened unto us, and Moses appeared before us, and committed unto us the keys of the gathering of Israel from the four parts of the earth, and leading up of the 10 tribes from the land of the north." This is what Nehemiah is talking about, the gathering of the scattered, the diaspora, those dispersed throughout the world. Because of their sins, they were judged and scattered. It's actually somewhat merciful that they were scattered in a sense. It's amazing how God is both justice and mercy. So Jared Halverson is going to explain some of this, and then we'll be done with this episode. He says, "On my mission, some people would be incredulous that, wait, what? Peter, James, and John appeared to Joseph Smith to restore the Melchizedek priesthood? Oh, yeah? What? John the Baptist appeared to Joseph and Oliver to restore the Aaronic priesthood? Oh, yeah? And that's just the beginning. When we get to section 128, there's all kinds of visions and angels and heavenly manifestations. Joseph was a spiritual amphibian, as comfortable on this side of the veil as the other. Land or water, heaven or earth, it was all familiar territory to him. In this one, Moses, Elias, and Elijah all appear. Why do they do it? To restore keys. In a way, this is a modern day equivalent of the Mount of Transfiguration experienced in Matthew 17, Mark 9, and Luke 9. Peter, James, and John were there, and Moses, Elias, and Elijah came and appeared to them to restore priesthood keys, to part the veil and explain some things about the atonement of Jesus Christ, the death that he would accomplish at Jerusalem. That's my favorite verb. Death is not something he suffered. Death is something he accomplished. They explain the transfiguration of the earth that will someday take place. And Peter, James, and John's calling and elections were made sure. The Mount of Transfiguration is an incredible event in history. And I sometimes joke with students by asking, did Moses ever enter the promised land? No, he was stopped at Mount Nebo. Well, think a little harder. Actually, he just had to wait a millennium plus. Yes, he has entered the promised land from above, not from east over Jordan. In a similar vein, those ancient worthies came to the Kirtland, Ohio temple, no longer as just translated beings. Remember, Moses and Elijah never tasted death the way that they could come back and restore keys pre-resurrection. Jesus is the first fruits, but once Jesus is resurrected, these three saints could be resurrected too. So we can picture these three now as they return again to restore priesthood keys. And now they have a resurrected body to do it, not just a translated one. What were Moses' keys? It is so fitting that it would be he who gathered Israel out of Egypt and brought them to a promised land, that he would then give keys to a modern Moses to go and do likewise. Gather, scattered Israel. You just prayed for it. You just prayed for it a week ago. Time to go. And that's interesting. So they just prayed for this a week prior, the founder of the restored gospel. And now a week later, they have this experience. Time to go. And so, like Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, when he says, Peter, I promise you the keys of the kingdom. One chapter later, Matthew 17, Here they come on the Mount of Transfiguration. Go gather Israel on this side of the veil. Go do missionary work. In this moment, Moses becomes the embodiment of that mission of the church of proclaiming the gospel. In fact, there's a verse in Deuteronomy that says that once Israel repents, and see if you guys recognize this verse based upon what we've been reading here in Deuteronomy. Then the Lord, Yehovah, thy God, thy Elohim, will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither Yehovah thy Elohim hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out unto the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will Yehovah thy Elohim gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. Where's that? That's last episode, Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 and 4. So Jared Halverson ends his footnote by saying, this wasn't back in Exodus when they were scattered to Egypt. I'm going to gather you home. This is in Deuteronomy when they were ready to cross the Jordan River now. We've already been gathered out of Egypt. This is past. The past is prelude, just a preview. So he's just saying the past that we're reading about, we're studying here, is just a preview of coming attractions and destructions and scatterings. He doesn't give them all the details. It will come later, but he does promise that through repentance they will be gathered home. And how fitting that it would be Moses who would restore those keys to Joseph Smith to initiate the gathering of Israel in this final dispensation. Verse 12, again from the book of section 110. After this, Elias appeared. So this is the vision that they're having, and committed the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham, saying, this in us and our seed, all generations after us should be blessed. Verse 13, after this vision had closed, another great and glorious vision burst upon us from Elijah the prophet, who was taken to heaven without tasting death, stood before us and said, verse 14, behold, the time has fully come, which was spoken of by the mouth of Malachi, testifying that he, Elijah, should be sent before the great and dreadful day of the Lord come. 15, verse 15, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the children to the fathers, lest the whole earth be smitten with a curse. And verse 16, therefore the keys of this dispensation are committed unto your hands, and by this ye may know that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is near, even at the door. So talk about a climax, Halverson says. It's go time. These truths, powers, and authorities have been restored to the earth. The dispensation of the fullness of times has gotten fuller, and the receiving of these keys from dispensation heads past to be able to continue in this final dispensation, this final one, to bring to pass God's work and glory, to give the opportunity for all of God's children to come home. It is amazing what happened on this day in Kirtland, Ohio. It's not just that Elijah was waiting all this time, it's that the house of Israel has been waiting all this time. Every Passover, may we remember that this was during Passover week. The Jews would set an empty chair and place settings for Elijah at the dinner table, knowing that, as Malachi had promised, someday he'll return. They don't totally know why, but they know he will, and we know he did. There's a classic story of Elder LeGrand Richards. He was a hilarious apostle. And just so you know, Papa John met LeGrand Richards when I was probably 15 years old on a youth trip to Utah. We stopped at church headquarters. Are you kidding me? And they just said, without an appointment, here, LeGrand Richards is going to come visit with your church group. It was pretty cool. And he was a very humorous man. But he says, or Brother Halverson says, he was a hilarious apostle. He had a great sense of humor. Near the end of his life, as he became so old and they had to amputate a leg, and he still had the best attitude. He joked that if God wants to take me, he's going to have to do it one piece at a time. He was just a fun-loving, hilarious man, and he was really good friends with Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem at the time. So Papa John inserted the picture of these two amazing men, LeGrand Richards, LDS Apostle from 1952 to 1983. I bet I met him in the late 70s, maybe 1980. And then here's Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem from 1965 to 1993. They were friends. They knew each other. At one point, Jared Halverson says, LeGrand Richards was in Jerusalem, and Teddy was showing him around town, and he went into the old Jewish synagogue. And there in the synagogue is a very ornate chair, and it's called the seat of Elijah. He will return. We have a seat for him at the Passover dinner table. We have a seat for him in our synagogue. When will he come to occupy it? And so, because LeGrand was good friends with the mayor and could get away with it, and Mayor Teddy also had a sense of humor, LeGrand Richards, he played stupid and pointed to the ornamental chair reserved for Elijah and asked, "Hey, Teddy, that's a fancy chair. What's that for?" And falling into Elder Richards' trap, Teddy responded. Mayor Teddy said, "It's called the seat of Elijah." And he starts to explain. And LeGrand Richards just smiles with a kind of impish wink and then says, "We'll tell them to take it down. Take the chair down. They missed him. He already came." And then he explained what took place in section 110 back in 1836 that we just read about the visions and Moses and Elijah and these heavenly beings coming back, these dispensation heads. And then Howard says, "I don't know how Mayor Teddy Kollek responded, but there is something amazing about all of these threads coming together into this beautiful tapestry right there in Kirtland, Ohio in 1836. The threads of ancient Jewish prophecy and modern fulfillment, the threads of different dispensations coming together in this final dispensation, the different threads of proclaiming the gospel. Thank you, Moses, of perfecting the saints. Thank you, Elias, of redeeming the dead. Thank you, Elijah. All of these powers and authorities and keys and purposes and promises coming together in the house of God. That's where it takes place. The temple is where God keeps his promises. It's where we go to make some and to receive the promises that God would make with us. There is much more verse from Ezekiel, the same Ezekiel who had such glorious visions of a temple yet to be built. He who spoke of show them what it looks like, then show them what it looks like again. That's Ezekiel 43:10 and 11. Well, in Ezekiel 46:9, we read, "But when the people of the land shall come before Jehovah in the solemn feast, he that entereth in by the way of the north gate to worship shall go out by the way of the south gate, and he that entered in by the way of the south gate shall go forth by the way of the north gate. He shall not return by the way of the gate whereby he came in, but shall go forth over against it." So Jared says, now the first time I read that, I was thinking, why? That's interesting. He's really specific. Is this like traffic control? Like when you're picking up the kids from school, no U-turns in the middle of the feast? Just keep on going all the way through? There may have been some truth to that, but the more I pondered that principle, Jared said, I realized, wait a minute, what's the Lord teaching? If you come into the temple in one direction and go out in the opposite, in other words, do not leave the same way you came. We've talked about incomings and outgoings. We need to make sure there's a change in our life, a change in temperature with this rushing mighty wind, a change of heart and a mind and perspective as you've learned within God's house of learning, as you become more glorious in his house of glory. Please remember that the next time you go to the temple, yes, you'll probably have to go out the same door. But spiritually speaking, when you go into the house of God, make sure you leave it different. That is the difference his house is meant to make. So Papa John just wants to interject and then we're done. And for those of you of the Protestant or Catholic or Jewish background, this is definitely the LDS restored gospel perspective. And if you've never had it explained to you, I hope you see why we get so excited about connecting the dots, because we feel like we're participating in what our Hebrew scholar keeps describing as part of the gathering, and we are going to play our role just like every other people and age before us. We're going to play our role, however imperfectly. We're going to do the best we can. It's just our turn to almost get it right, like every other age, people, and gathered group that God gave assignments to do. Now, Papa John says, according to the Latter-day Saint, the LDS doctrine, Moses did not die a normal death, but was translated, taken to heaven without tasting death. While the Bible reports his death in Deuteronomy 34, which we're studying right now, LDS scripture clarifies that he was translated to enable him to appear on the Mount of Transfiguration to bestow keys upon Peter, James, and John. So, 3 points. Translated beings from the Pearl of Great Price and in Alma 45:19, and the LDS Bible Dictionary clarifies that Moses was translated and did not die a traditional death. That is our belief from the restored gospel. The Mount of Transfiguration. Moses appeared as a translated rather than resurrected being to Jesus and his apostles in the New Testament. And in Kirtland, Ohio, the appearance there in the temple, the first temple ever built during the end times, as far the first temple built as part of the restoration. In that appearance, Moses later appeared as a resurrected being right there in the Kirtland, Ohio temple in 1836 to restore the keys of the gathering of Israel to Joseph Smith, which is only appropriate considering he did it all. He got clear up to the finish line, but was not allowed to go in. But God honors him, and he'll do the same for us. God honors those who honor him. That is my witness to my children, my children's children, and my future posterity, my extended family and friends. May we build each other up in our faith, and may we benefit from pushing the boundaries of our understanding between our different denominations and faith backgrounds. I'm grateful for these scholars who we're participating in their conversations with as they've gone through the scriptures previously, and Papa John has followed them for years. I'm grateful for the God whom I love and serve. And I'm grateful for the indwelling of his presence that continues to burn within my soul some 9 years after the first meeting. With that, we'll end this episode. I look forward to the next episode with everyone, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.